The Highway of Tears murders is a haunting and tragic saga that has unfolded along a stretch of Highway 16 in British Columbia, Canada, and surrounding areas since the late 1960s. This desolate corridor, spanning over 700 kilometers from Prince Rupert to Prince George, has earned its grim moniker due to the staggering number of Indigenous women, girls, and other marginalized individuals who have vanished or been found murdered under mysterious circumstances. The stories of these victims, and the lack of justice for their families, have captured international attention and sparked outrage over the systemic failures that perpetuate violence against Indigenous peoples in Canada. The origins of the Highway of Tears murders can be traced back to the late 1960s, although some sources suggest that incidents may have occurred even earlier. The exact number of victims is difficult to determine due to the remote nature of the region and the lack of comprehensive record keeping, but estimates range from anywhere between 18 to over 40 individuals. Many of the victims were Indigenous women and girls, underscoring the disproportionate impact of violence on Indigenous communities in Canada. The cases along the Highway of Tears share disturbing similarities, with many of the victims being young, Indigenous women who were last seen hitchhiking along the highway. Most of the disappearances occurred along Highway 16, a lonely and desolate stretch of road that winds through dense forests and rugged terrain. The transient nature of hitchhiking, combined with the isolation of the area, made it easy for perpetrators to target vulnerable individuals without fear of detection. Despite the alarming number of cases and the striking similarities between them, progress in solving the Highway of Tears murders has been painfully slow. Many of the investigations were hindered by a lack of resources, jurisdictional disputes, and systemic biases that marginalized Indigenous peoples and their communities. The failure to adequately address these cases has led to accusations of institutional racism and systemic failures within law enforcement and government agencies. The Highway of Tears murders gained renewed attention in the early 2000s, thanks in part to the efforts of Indigenous activists, community members, and advocacy groups who refused to let the victims be forgotten. Their tireless advocacy and demands for accountability pushed the issue into the national spotlight and pressured authorities to take action. In 2006, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, launched Project EPANA, a task force dedicated to investigating the unsolved murders and disappearances along the Highway of Tears. Despite the efforts of Project EPANA and other initiatives, progress in solving the Highway of Tears cases has been slow and uneven. While some cases have been resolved and suspects identified, many others remain unsolved, leaving families without closure and perpetrators unpunished. The lack of resolution in these cases has had a profound impact on the families of the victims, who continue to grieve their loss and demand answers. The Highway of Tears murders have brought to light broader issues of systemic injustice and discrimination faced by Indigenous peoples in Canada. The disproportionate rates of violence against Indigenous women and girls reflect deeper societal issues rooted in colonialism, racism, and inequality. Calls for justice for the victims of the Highway of Tears have become intertwined with broader demands for Indigenous rights, autonomy, and self-determination. Despite the challenges and setbacks, efforts to seek justice for the victims of the Highway of Tears murders persist. Families, activists, and advocates continue to push for accountability, transparency, and meaningful action to address the root causes of violence against Indigenous women and girls. The Highway of Tears serves as a stark reminder of the ongoing injustices faced by Indigenous communities in Canada and the urgent need for systemic change. Only by confronting these issues head-on and working together can we hope to bring an end to the cycle of violence and ensure that all Canadians, regardless of background or identity, can live free from fear and discrimination. The Highway of Tears murders is not merely a series of cold cases, it is a symbol of the systemic failures and injustices that plague Indigenous communities in Canada. It serves as a stark reminder of the ongoing legacy of colonialism, racism, and inequality that continues to marginalize Indigenous peoples and perpetuate violence against them. The victims of the Highway of Tears murders deserve justice, and their families deserve closure. It is imperative that we continue to shine a light on these cases, demand accountability from those responsible for investigating them, and work towards creating a society where Indigenous lives are valued and protected.